Alright lads, this one has been hanging over me like the flippin' plague. Can't curse because it's in the first minute or so. I need to get this out of the way. Album of the year 2024. Honestly, this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Any like personal family issues or anything like that, forget all that. This is the hardest thing I've ever had to get myself through. It's too hard to pick an album of the year. It's actually, I look forward to it all year and then I get to it and I'm like, this is painful. This is too hard. There's too many albums. And like, my opinion changes every single day. And it's impossible. But I have narrowed down to a top 10. And again, this changes so frequently. So as Steve OG says, I'm just going to keep using Steve OG as the reference because he's the one who said it. This is just a snapshot in time, okay? It's not the end of the world if I don't have an album in a position that you think I should have it in. And I honestly just changed it around 2 seconds ago. Again, I did an episode of the Metal Roundup like 2 days ago with Stephen Bird where we talked about all this. And even since then, my list has kind of moved around a bit. Now, number one and everything is still the same, but things are going to change over time. That's the point. And it's going to keep moving around. Right now, I'm just going to do it. Let's just do it. Okay, so number 10, when I look at my list on my right hand screen here, I look at it and I'm like, this is the most standout album to me, just in terms of like how surprised I am with my own picks. I didn't expect this band to end up in the top 10. But over the past couple of weeks since I've reacted to this album, I've really enjoyed it. So it is a band that I never even knew existed really before 2024, and that's why I'm surprised. It's A Piece of Me I Never Let You Find by Kane Hill. Number 9 is The Impossible album. I think a lot of people are kind of referring to this as like the impossible comeback, and I completely agree. It's just one of those things that was never going to go right, but they somehow kind of pulled it off. New vocalist, Emily Armstrong, did a fucking fantastic job. Whatever you think about her as a vocalist or even as a person, let's just brush all that to the side and look at it as an album. I think it's a really solid album. Not even because it's like, oh, it kind of sounds like Linkin Park. It's just a good album. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Regardless of what I think about Linkin Park's previous stuff, I think it has like a fresh new sound, whilst also being quite nostalgic. It is From Zero by Linkin Park.
Let you cut me open just to watch me burn.
Number 8 is kind of like one that I was unsure of even including in this list because they did a great job, and I think from a marketing perspective this really worked as a release because they basically got to have so much hype around 2 album releases, even though they just kind of like merged everything into one album. So last year, Night Verses released Every Sound Has a Color in the Valley of Night. I almost messed that name up there. Part 1, and that album was fantastic. That was in my top 5 last year, I believe. And then this year they brought out Every Sound Has a Color in the Valley of Night Part 2, which was an album also, and they just like merged those 2 albums together. Now they flow really, really well as like one full album, but they've released them as 2 different albums. So my number 8 is Night Verses Every Sound Has a Color in the Valley of Night Part 2. Number 7 on my list is none other than Kermit the Frog's band. Sorry, I ruined this band. I nearly said the name. I ruined this band for myself by starting to, just one day I was like listening to the final song on this album and I was like, oh my god, this is Kermit the Frog. Can't unhear it. I've told other people and I've also ruined the band for them. So look, if I'm going down, I'm bringing you lot with me. It's Vola, Friend of a Phantom. Number 6 is a brilliant album. It is an album that I wasn't expecting to love as much as I did, despite Metal Burb and Steve OG being on my ass about checking this album out because they are the biggest fans of this guy. Really, really impressive album. Probably the best vibes from any album on this list. It's just so fun from start to finish. Impossible to like listen to this and just not be in a good mood. It is Bill Murray, American Motorsports Brothers. Number 5 on my list is honestly being carried by how good some of the singles are. And then some of the tracks that dropped with the album release were so good as well. But there's also some songs to me that I just don't really enjoy and I don't really go back to. And I just don't think the album has much of a flow to it. It feels a little bit disjointed in parts, and I've very rarely found myself going back from like track 1 to track whatever it is. and like listening the full way through. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just me, but I have heard the same criticisms from other people as well. And that's the main reason that this album is not number one. I think it's like minor adjustments to be made for this to be number one, because the singles on this album are ridiculous. It is, if you haven't already guessed, Bring Me the Horizon, Post-Human, Next Gen. Number 4 is surprising, to say the least. Before 2024, if you told me this band would be in my top 5 albums, I'd say, what the hell, brothers? Well, here we are. 2024 seemingly is the year of hardcore bands dropping absolute rippers. It is Knocked Loose, You Won't Go Before You're Supposed to. Number 3 is a really late addition to the top 5. This was initially at my number 6 spot, but I did a little like movements because I listened to it again and I'm like, this is just a stupidly good album. It's caveman core. It's very surprising that it's even in my top 5, especially with like the album we've just had on. There's a seagull outside that I'm going to launch my fucking microphone at if he doesn't shut up. Anyways, I've completely lost my train of thought there because of the seagull outside. I'm not retaking this. It's Boundaries. Death is Little More.
This world is evil! I am the devil!
Okay, number 2, lads. And allow me to cheat a little bit and use my phone, because actually, when trying to deliberate which album was number 1, I had to like take down so many notes on my phone and actually really like technically break this down and be like, why is this number 1 and why is this number 2? And I'll just go with my description of why I think this is number 2 before I actually name the album. So, this band at number 2 has all of the potential in the world to go on and be the biggest band in the modern metalcore and thal scene. They're already there as the top dogs in a lot of people's eyes after just one album. I know I'm giving this away a lot, but just stay with me. The only thing stopping this from being number 1 was the non-singles. They were solid, but they couldn't quite match the level of the singles that we were treated to, I'm fucking this up, but we're continuing, that we were treated to like The Orphan Breed, Aquila, Remnant, and M&A. There's definitely an argument there. I can't read. Why am I doing this? Definitely an argument there for... I wrote this as well, I'm getting confused. Definitely an argument there for the album being sonically quite samey across the board. But that's the nature of metalcore and thal music. When you're tuned that low, there's only so far you can stretch the sonic spectrum. Proper fucking alliteration here. Is that what that word is? I don't know. But the length of the album really makes this not feel like too big of a deal. I think the highs on this album are higher, this is very important, than the highs on my number 1 album. However, I just don't think this album is as consistent across the board as my number 1 album. And for that reason, number 2 is, if you haven't already guessed, even though I've named every fucking single on the album, Alt from the New World. Okay, and number 1, again, I've got the phone out for this because copy and paste what I said for number 2. I need to just make sure I get all these points across because I think it's important as to why this is my number 1 album. And yeah, I think this album's winning on a technicality at this point. I don't even really know, but I think I'm kind of happy with my decision. Anyway, okay, let me land. Let me first start by saying I do not think this is a perfect album by any stretch, and I definitely understand the criticism that it does sound a little samey across the board, similar to what I said about the Alt album. But this is sometimes a trade-off with creating an album that has a memorable and recognizable theme or motif. Similar to what I said about the Alt album, it can sound samey across the board. It's similar to the likes of Humanity's Last Breath with a lot of their albums, but in particular their last album, which Ashen, I almost forgot the name there. Yes, Ashen sounds quite samey across the board. Again, you can only stretch that sonic spectrum so far when you're tuned so fucking low. There's only so many sounds you're going to be able to pull off with the tuning that low. So yes, it's going to sound quite samey across the board, but I think that is a big trade-off when it comes to creating like a vibe with an album or like a theme musically, because at least the album has a memorable theme. I think that's where like the likes of Bring Me the Horizon at number 5, it just feels a little bit disjointed because so many of the songs sound so different. And I get that it's supposed to be like a jukebox of, you know, hyper pop and modern metal and like also nostalgia, but it just means that it doesn't gel very well in my opinion. I think memorable albums, for the most part, there is exceptions to the rule, are albums that like, when you think of it, you kind of think of a theme and the music that's tied to it. And this is a bit of a bold statement, but this album kind of feels like this I don't want to say generation because the album I'm about to mention isn't that old, but it feels like this era's All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us by Architects. I know that's crazy. Sonically, and just the overall like dread that this album gives you, it just makes me, this album is kind of an emotional album for me, you know. It's not like, again, I say that it has flaws musically for sure, and it can be samey, but let me keep cooking. A lot of the heavier moments sound very similar across the board, which is unfortunate. However, it's unbelievably consistent in terms of each track's replayability. Where tracks maybe fall into the safe or predictable or even generic category, there's always a redeemable quality, whether it be a fun breakdown, riff, or catchy chorus. The start of the album has more of an old school metalcore flair to it, when the intensity picks up, mainly coming from the guitars. There's a lot of examples I could name, but I'm not going to do that because it'll give it away. You've probably already guessed. However, the second half of the album, starting from Come What May, and including The Black and Continuum for me, is this band at their absolute best. It's hard to describe it, but the use of the violin in the second half of the album feels far classier and less tacky than the first 5 tracks. Come What May is an absolute masterpiece in modern metal. For me, it's up there with my favourite track from them, which is Temptation. It feels like a classical track catered for metalheads as opposed to a metal band trying to include violin, which I do think Imminence can fall... Not Imminence. It's Imminence, The Black, but let me keep talking, okay? This is fucked. That is a big point for me, is that like some of their tracks feel like they're trying to shoehorn the violin to like make a point that they are the violin band, but the latter part of this album with the songs I've just mentioned, with like Come What May and Continuum, feels like a classical track that's like catered towards metalheads, you know what I mean? It doesn't feel the opposite way around. Anyway, I'd maybe remove the inclusion of L'appel du vide, as it feels like it kills the momentum built by the tracks prior. One of the reasons I find modern metalcore so monotonous at times is the use of screams. When there isn't a well-defined theme or emotion in an album that warrants screaming, it gets bland after a while. With The Black, it feels very much similar to the theme of All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us by Architects, where each scream feels like it's being used to display some sort of grief or anguish or frustration or pain. Therefore, it aligns with the theme and makes more sense to me, feeling warranted and more emotional as opposed to just screaming because that's what metal bands do. Eddie killed it with the vocals in general in this album. It's amazing. Of course, I've already fucking ruined it, but it is Imminence, The Black. Yeah, just like a ridiculously consistent album. Like, I was trying to decide whether or not this would be number 1, and it wasn't number 1 for a long time. And then I just looked at the album, and I've liked every single song on this. Granted, I go back to some songs more than the others, but there's not a song on this apart from the 2 like interlude tracks or whatever that are kind of towards the end. Well, they're not really interlude tracks, but they're just instrumental tracks that are beautiful, don't get me wrong, but I'm not gonna like loop them as singles. It would be more just like if I'm listening to the album from start to finish. And this album, yes, has its flaws and can sound samey across the board for sure. It's not a perfect album, but it's probably the best album for me in 2024. I just think it's the most consistent. Like Come Hell or High Water I loved, Desolation I loved, Heaven Shall Burn I loved, Beyond the Pale I loved, Death by a Thousand Cuts I loved, Come What May I loved. Cul-de-sac is just your break in the album. It's an interlude, so we'll skip that. The Call of the Void I loved, Continuum I loved. L'appel du vide is again a beautiful song, but I feel like maybe it could be like left out and then just continue straight into The Black, which is again a fucking masterpiece of a song. It's so good. And then Le Noir is just your outro, which is again a beautiful outro track. So yeah, man, I mean, it's a fucking great album. I will say, and I don't want to like spoil the whole thing by saying this, but I mentioned this on the Metal Roundup podcast that myself, Stephen Burb, did the other day. So you'll see like a further addition to my thoughts right now if you go and subscribe to the Metal Roundup. But basically I was saying that I don't think this album would make it into my top 5 or even top 10 last year. I don't want to take anything away from the fact that Imminence have just won here. They, in my opinion, they have the best album of the year. But I think this year, full transparency, was not my favorite year for albums in metal in general. There was some really good albums and some fun standout moments, and there's a lot of honorable mentions that could have been in the top 10. It's just hard to fit everything in. But I just don't think that this album would even make it into my top 5 last year at least. Like, we look at Invent Animate's Heavener, Sleep Token, Take Me Back to Eden, even like, you know, we had Currents, and a lot of people didn't love Currents album. We had the Night Versus first version of the album, we had Unprocessed's album, we had Humanity's Last Breath, we had Polaris. Like, we had so many big albums. I don't know if this album even like makes it into a top 10 with those albums mentioned, which is kind of mental for an entire year. But I think 2023 we were just very, very spoiled with a lot of releases, and again, not taking away anything from Imminence, it's still my album of the year, man. It's my album of the year. I'm not sure if people agree with that or not. I don't know. I just had to pick one, and it was between Alt and Imminence, and I just think Alt was on track for the whole year for album of the year, and then the album came out, and the non-singles didn't excite me as much as the singles. So that's pretty much it, lads. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm yapping now at this point. We'll have maybe a try not to headbang challenge. I'll do my own little spin like I did last year, but in this time I'll just do like a compilation. I won't talk. It'll just be absolute banger central. But lads, that's all for me. Thank you so much for watching. I'm signing out. Look after yourselves. See you in the next one. Happy New Year. Love yous. Bye.